I have never trusted deep water, not because I couldn't swim, but because of the way it waits. Lakes can sparkle, rivers can sing, but the water held back behind old dams has a different kind of silence. It feels as though it remembers every tree, every road, and every forgotten home resting beneath its surface. Years ago, I began collecting stories from people who lived near those places. Caretakers, fishermen, truck drivers, hikers, and lonely night workers all told me the same thing in different words. They said the water watched them. Most evenings, I sit on the wooden porch outside my cabin with a warm blanket over my knees and a lantern glowing beside me. Pine branches sway gently overhead while distant frogs call from somewhere beyond the tree line. The air carries a faint scent of damp earth after an afternoon rain, and every now and then the wind reaches me from the lake below, cool enough to make me pull the blanket a little tighter. Those quiet moments should feel peaceful. Instead, they remind me of the first story. An old dam hidden between mountains. A place where the lights flickered for no reason. Where the water stayed perfectly still even during heavy storms. Where workers avoided looking over the railing after sunset because someone or something always seemed to be looking back. I laughed when I first heard those stories. Then I visited the dam myself. And that's when I saw it. That autumn evening began with a slow climb up the old observation deck overlooking Ashwood Dam. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only a pale band of gold resting above the trees. Fresh rain had passed less than an hour earlier, and the wooden railing felt cool beneath my hand. The scent of weathered pine drifted to the hillside, while tiny drops of water clung to the needles overhead. A retired dam inspector had invited me there. He had spent 30 years watching the reservoir from that very overlook. When I arrived, he was already waiting beside the railing with a faded green jacket zipped to his chin. His binoculars rested on the bench beside him as though they had never truly belonged anywhere else. He smiled politely, not warmly, just enough to show he remembered how. "I don't come here every day anymore," he said quietly, "only when the weather feels familiar." His words settled into the evening, without asking for attention. Below us, the reservoir stretched farther than I expected. The surface reflected the fading sky, like dark glass. A few gulls circled above the water, their wings catching the last of the light. None of them made a sound. That was the first thing I noticed. I had grown up near rivers where birds argued from sunrise until nightfall. Their voices always reminded me of family fishing trips with my father. He believed silence in nature meant something had changed, even if people couldn't see it yet. Standing beside that overlook, I remembered his words without knowing why. The inspector rested both hands on the railing. "I used to count them," he whispered. I looked toward the water. "The birds," he shook his head. "The sightings." His voice remained calm, almost thoughtful. "The first few years I wrote every one down." He tapped the pocket of his jacket. "After a while, there wasn't much point." A cool breeze crossed the reservoir, carrying the clean smell of rainwater mixed with fresh leaves. Tiny ripples spread across the shoreline, before fading into smooth water again. The inspector picked up the binoculars. "You should look." I accepted them without thinking. The rubber around the eyepieces had become soft with age. Small scratches covered the metal frame. They felt heavier than they looked. I raised them toward the opposite shore. At first I saw only trees, tall evergreens, large gray rocks, an old section of shoreline where the forest reached almost to the water. Then I noticed someone standing there, far across the reservoir, a single figure, too distant to make out clearly. They stood perfectly upright near the edge of the trees, wearing something pale that caught the last light of evening. They weren't waving. They weren't moving, just standing, watching the water. I lowered the binoculars. "There," I said. "Someone's on the other side." The inspector did not look. "I know. You've seen him before?" He nodded once, more times than I can remember. His answer should have sounded impossible. Instead, it sounded tired. I lifted the binoculars again. The figure remained exactly where I had seen it before. Not closer, not farther away. For several quiet moments, I studied the shoreline. Something bothered me. It wasn't the person. It was everything around them. There was no road, no trail, no dock, Nothing that explained why anyone would stand in that isolated place as darkness settled over the mountains. I lowered the lenses once more. How did they get there? The inspector looked across the water with gentle eyes. I asked myself that for years. He paused. Eventually I stopped asking. A branch overhead released a few lingering drops of rain. They landed softly against a wooden deck before rolling through the cracks between the boards. The evening became cooler. I rubbed my hands together out of habit. My grandmother always told me that cold evenings sharpened old memories. Whenever autumn arrived, she would light a small candle beside her kitchen window because she believed lonely places deserve kindness. For some reason, I thought about that candle now. Perhaps because the silence around the reservoir felt lonely too. Neither of us spoke for another minute. The gulls continued circling. Their wings cut through the fading light, without a single cry. Finally, I lifted the binoculars one last time. The shoreline stood empty. The pale figure had vanished. There had been no movement, no place to hide. One moment someone had been standing there. The next, there was only forest and dark water. I searched left, then right. Nothing. Slowly, I lowered the binoculars. My hands paused. The eyepieces felt warm, not from the fading sunlight, not from my face. Warm, as though someone else had been holding them only moments before. I looked toward the inspector. He noticed the expression on my face before I spoke. You felt it. It wasn't a question. I swallowed but said nothing. The sky had almost turned completely blue-gray now. The first stars waited above the ridge, while the reservoir lost the last reflection of daylight. The inspector slipped the binoculars gently back onto the bench. I stopped bringing friends here, he said after a long silence. They always noticed that. Neither of us looked across the water again. Far below the overlook, something made a single splash. Small, quiet, much too far from shore. We listened until the ripples disappeared. Nothing answered after that. Only a silence that somehow felt as though it had been waiting for us all along. The cabin overlooked Blackwater Lake from the top of a gentle hill. It was the kind of place people rented when they wanted to disappear for a few days. One gravel road led in, and the same road led back out through a forest of tall fir trees. By the time I arrived, late one October afternoon, the sky had already begun turning the soft gray that comes before an early sunset. The owner handed me an old brass key without much conversation. "You'll sleep well here," he said with a faint smile. Then he hesitated. "If the lights go out, don't worry. They always come back." He climbed into his truck before I could ask what he meant. The cabin was small but comfortable. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, and a wide wooden porch faced the lake and the distant outline of the dam. A single rocking chair rested near the railing, worn smooth from years of use. Its paint had faded until only small patches of white remained. Inside, everything smelled faintly of old candle wax and polished wood. The scent reminded me of my grandmother's house. She rarely trusted electric lights during storms. Instead, she filled every room with candles, saying soft light made a home feel less lonely. As a child, I believed her without question. Even years later, that familiar smell always brought her gentle voice back to me. I unpacked slowly, made tea, opened a book I never really intended to read. Outside, the lake reflected the cloudy evening sky until it became difficult to tell where the water ended and the horizon began. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. After dark, I stepped onto the porch with my mug warm in my hands. The dam stood far across the lake, its warning lights glowing like tiny stars above the water. Somewhere deep in the trees, an owl called once before falling quiet again. The rocking chair remained exactly where I had first seen it, facing the lake. I stayed outside until the air grew cold enough to send me back indoors. That first night passed without anything unusual. The second evening began almost the same way. Clouds gathered over the mountains. The wind stayed gentle. The cabin settled with quiet wooden creaks as the temperature dropped. Then every light inside the house went out. There was no flicker, no warning, just darkness. For a moment I stood perfectly still. The fireplace had gone cold hours earlier, leaving only the faint outline of furniture visible through windows. I found the matches inside a kitchen drawer and lit one of the candles sitting on the table. Its small flame filled the room with warm golden light. The smell of melted wax slowly spread to the cabin, carrying another memory of my grandmother. She used to say some lakes borrowed voices, not forever, only long enough to remind people of someone they missed. I smiled at the thought. It sounded like one of those stories meant to keep children close to home after sunset. Even so, I found myself glancing toward the porch. The rocking chair moved, only a little, forward, then back. The trees beyond the railing remained perfectly calm. No branches swayed. No leaves drifted across the porch. The chair continued its gentle motion. I watched for several moments before opening the door. Cool evening air slipped into the cabin. The chair slowed, then stopped. Everything became quiet again. I stepped outside with the candle resting inside a glass lantern. The wooden boards beneath my feet felt dry despite the afternoon drizzle. I walked around the chair once, expecting to find uneven boards or some simple explanation. There was nothing unusual. The chair faced the lake exactly as before. I carried the lantern back inside. A few minutes later, the electricity returned as though nothing had happened. The ceiling lights glowed softly. The refrigerator began running again. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm. The third evening followed the same pattern. Just before full darkness, the power disappeared. The candle filled the room with its familiar scent, and the rocking chair began moving before the first breeze touched the porch. This time I stayed inside. The slow rhythm of the chair echoed faintly through the walls. Back, forward, back again. Each movement sounded calm enough to become almost comforting, until it stopped, not gradually, all at once. Silence settled over the cabin. I realized I had been holding my breath. The porch remained hidden beyond the window, its outline barely visible beneath the pale glow of the moon. Then I heard it, not from the lake, not from the trees, from directly beneath the porch. A voice, soft enough that I almost mistook it for the wind. It spoke only one word, my name, perfectly, exactly the way my grandmother used to say it whenever she wanted me to come inside before nightfall. Every hair along my arms lifted. I stood frozen beside the table, listening for another word. None came. The lights returned a few seconds later. The candle flame became small beside the brighter bulbs overhead. I walked carefully to the window. The rocking chair stood completely still, facing away from the lake now, facing the cabin, facing me. I closed the curtains without looking beneath the porch. Even today, I don't know who whispered my name, and I have never gone back to find out whether the chair is still waiting for someone to answer. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the highway shining beneath a pale winter sky. Around noon, I found Miller's Diner sitting beside the reservoir, its faded red sign leaning slightly toward the road as though it had grown tired over the years. Every passing truck slowed for the curve nearby, but only a few pulled into the gravel parking lot. Inside, the room felt comfortably warm. The rich smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixing with warm bread coming from the kitchen. Every booth looked well used. Old photographs covered the walls, showing fishermen holding impossible catches and smiling families standing beside the lake decades ago. I chose a booth beside the front window. The waitress noticed before I even opened the menu. Without saying anything, she carried my coffee to another table. "Most folks don't sit there," she said gently. Her voice carried no warning, only habit. I smiled. "I like the view." She glanced toward the reservoir beyond the glass. "So did they?" Before I could ask what she meant, another customer called her name. I moved anyway, not because I believed her, because something about the window made the room feel colder. The booth she suggested sat farther from the glass, beside an old jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The vinyl seat gave a soft sigh as I settled in. Outside, trucks continued passing. Each time the diner door opened, a faint smell of motor oil drifted inside before disappearing beneath the scent of coffee. An older man wearing a faded work jacket stirred sugar into his mug without drinking it. Two younger truck drivers spoke quietly near the counter. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward the large window facing the lake. Never for long. The waitress returned carrying a slice of apple pie. I didn't order that. I know. She smiled. You looked like you needed something warm. The pie tasted homemade. The cinnamon reminded me of autumn afternoons in my mother's kitchen, where desserts always cooled on the windowsill before anyone was allowed to touch them. For a little while, the diner felt almost peaceful. Then the waitress sat across from me. Only for a moment. She folded a dish towel between her hands. You travel much? A little. You collecting stories? I nodded. She looked toward the reservoir again. Then someone probably sent you here. I admitted they had. She wasn't surprised. They all asked about the disappearances. Her words were quiet enough that no one else seemed to notice. People went missing? Some. She paused. Some came back. The coffee suddenly tasted less comforting. What do you mean? The waitress looked at the empty booth beside the window. They'd disappear for years. She rubbed the edge of the towel slowly. Families held funerals. Then one night, she stopped speaking. The front door opened. Cold air slipped inside before the smell of engine oil followed it. A delivery driver entered, nodded politely, and sat at the counter. Nobody continued the conversation until the door closed again. The waitress finally stood. I've said enough. She returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. By evening, most travelers had left. Only a few regular customers remained. Outside, darkness settled over the reservoir until the water disappeared completely. The diner grew quieter. Even the kitchen sound became softer. At exactly midnight, the cook carried a hot plate from the kitchen. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, without speaking. He placed it on the last table beside the window. The table was empty. No menu, no coat, no customer. The food steamed gently beneath the hanging light. No one reacted. Not the truck drivers. Not the waitress. Not the cook. It happened as naturally as pouring another cup of coffee. 5 minutes passed. The food remained untouched. 10 minutes. Still no one came. I leaned toward the waitress as she wiped nearby tables. Who ordered that? She didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the clock above the kitchen door. Midnight had passed. The front door never opened. No footsteps approached. Yet every person inside seemed content to leave the meal exactly where it sat. Finally, curiosity won. I stood, slowly across the room. The plate remained warm. Steam curled gently upward before disappearing into light above. I looked around the diner. Everyone had stopped talking. Every conversation, every spoon, every coffee cup. The entire room had fallen silent. I turned toward the waitress. Who does this belong to? She froze with the towel still in her hands. The cook lowered his eyes. One truck driver quietly placed money on the counter. The other stood without finishing his meal. No one answered. One by one, they walked toward the exit. The bell above the door rang softly each time someone left. Within a minute, only the waitress and I remained. She collected my empty coffee cup. You should head back before the roads get dark. They already are. She nodded. Exactly. I looked once more at the untouched meal. It was still warm, still waiting. The waitress gently picked up the plate. She carried it into the kitchen. When she returned, her face looked older somehow. As she unlocked the front door for me, she whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. They always come back hungry. She never explained who she meant. I never asked again. The door closed behind me. The parking lot was empty. Through the diner's front window, I could still see the last table. Someone was sitting there now. I chose not to look twice. It was nearly an hour after sunset when I began driving across the old spillway road. The mountains had faded into dark shapes against the sky, and the reservoir stretched beside me like a sheet of black glass. The road was narrow, with low concrete barriers separating passing cars from the long drop toward the water below. Traffic had disappeared miles earlier. For several minutes, I had the road entirely to myself. The heater filled the car with welcome warmth, while my headlights reached only a short distance ahead. I turned on the radio to break the silence. A familiar song began, then dissolved into static. I changed stations. Another burst of music. More static. Every station faded the same way. The sound reminded me of an old radio my father kept in his workshop. Whenever storms rolled across the hills, he'd tap the side of it with one finger and smile. Some places don't like being interrupted, he used to say. At the time, I thought he was joking. Crossing the spillway, I wasn't so sure. The tires rolled onto the long stretch of concrete built across the dam itself. The steering wheel felt colder beneath my hands. Even the air inside the car seemed different now. I glanced at the outside temperature display. It had dropped several degrees within moments. No wind moved across the reservoir. No birds crossed the sky. Only the steady glow of my headlights reached ahead. Then something appeared on the pavement. Footprints. Dark. Clear. They crossed from one side of the road toward the center. I slowed. The prints looked damp, though the surface around them remained dry. Each one was perfectly spaced, as though someone had been walking calmly across the spillway. I followed them with my headlights. One step, another, then another. Halfway across the road, they ended. No turning, no return, no final step, only empty pavement beyond. I brought the car to a complete stop. The engine idled softly. I considered getting out. Instead, I lowered the driver's window a few inches. Cool night air drifted inside, carrying nothing except quiet. No insects, no distant traffic, not even water moving through the dam. I closed the window again. As I reached for the gear shift, something changed inside the car. Not a sound, not movement, a feeling. The passenger seat no longer seemed empty. I kept my eyes fixed on the windshield. My hands remained on the steering wheel. Every part of me wanted to turn my head, to prove there was nothing beside me. Instead, I remembered something else my father often said. If fear asks you to look, you don't always have to answer. I took one slow breath, shifted the car into drive, and continued across the spillway without turning toward the passenger seat. The radio returned on its own just as I reached the far side. Clear music, no static. The temperature climbed back to normal. When I finally stopped at a gas station several miles away, I gathered enough courage to glance across the empty passenger seat. The fabric looked undisturbed, except for one thing. A faint line of moisture crossed the cushion, as though someone had rested a wet hand there during the drive. I wiped it away without saying a word. Even now, whenever I cross a bridge after sunset, I keep my eyes on the road. Some questions are quieter when they remain unanswered. The cove rested on the northern side of the reservoir, where steep hills sheltered the water from the wind. I arrived just after sunrise, when a thin layer of morning mist floated above the surface, and the first light slipped gently through the trees. Wild grasses covered the shoreline. Among them grew patches of dried flowers that had somehow survived the changing seasons. Their sweet, faded fragrance drifted across the cool air. Someone once told me there had been gardens here before the valley was flooded. I believed it. The place carried the feeling of something remembered. Near the end of an old wooden dock sat a fisherman. He wore a faded brown hat and a thick wool coat despite the mild morning. His fishing rod rested across his knees. There was no hook, no bait, not even a bucket beside him. He simply watched the water. When I greeted him, he nodded politely. "Good morning. You fishing?" He smiled without taking his eyes off the lake. "Not anymore." I sat several feet away. The dock creaked softly beneath us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The quiet felt comfortable. Eventually, I asked why he still came every morning. He looked toward the distant shoreline. Old habits. After another pause, he added, "And listening." I followed his gaze. Listening for what? The thing that changed everything. His answer settled into the morning air. The fish stopped biting about 30 years ago. All of them. He nodded. One season they disappeared. No disease. No poison water. They simply stopped. He folded his weathered hands together. My father said something beneath the lake learned to listen. I almost laughed. Not because the story frightened me. Because it sounded exactly like the sort of tale older people invented to explain things no one understood. Perhaps he noticed. He smiled kindly. I thought the same. The mist began lifting as the sun climbed higher. The lake slowly revealed its smooth surface. Without thinking, I looked down. The old fisherman had done the same. His reflection rested clearly in the water. Mine appeared beside his. A small breeze crossed the cove. Tiny ripples disturbed both reflections. When the surface settled again, his reflection moved first. The old man remained perfectly still beside me. Yet the figure beneath the water slowly turned its head. Then it looked directly toward mine. I blinked. The image returned to normal. The fisherman stood carefully. I should be going. You never caught anything. I wasn't trying. He picked up his empty fishing rod. As he walked toward shore, I glanced back at the lake. His reflection remained sitting on the dock, watching me. I left before asking why he never looked at the water again. That evening, the maintenance worker met me at the South Service gate of Ashwood Dam. The sun had already slipped behind the ridge, leaving only a dull orange glow above the trees. A cold breeze drifted across the reservoir before disappearing into the concrete walls surrounding the entrance. The heavy steel door stood half open, waiting like it had expected us. The worker introduced himself only as Daniel. He looked to be in his 60s, with gray hair tucked beneath a faded hard hat and rough hands marked by decades of work. A flashlight hung from his belt, though he carried another in his hand. I don't usually bring visitors down here, he said quietly. His voice echoed softly against the concrete. But you're collecting stories. I nodded. He gave a small smile. Then you might as well hear one where it started. The steel door closed behind us with a slow metallic groan. The sound lingered long after the hallway became quiet. We walked down a sloping passage beneath the dam. Moisture clung to the cold stone walls, forming tiny droplets that reflected the pale beams of our flashlights. Somewhere deeper inside, water moved through unseen channels with slow, steady rhythm. The air smelled clean but ancient, carrying the faint scent of cold mineral rock. Daniel walked without hesitation. Every few minutes he pointed toward old maintenance markings painted on the walls. Most of these tunnels haven't changed since the 70s. His boots slowed beside an aging electrical panel. Some things never needed replacing. Others, he left the sentence unfinished. I noticed the first clock only a few minutes later. It hung above a rusted doorway. The hands pointed to 8:17. Nothing unusual, until we reached the next corridor. Another clock. This one read 6:42. I checked my watch. It was just after 7 in the evening. Neither clock matched. Power problems? I asked. Daniel didn't even look at them. They've done that longer than I've worked here. They're broken? So we thought. He continued walking. We replaced every one. And they never agreed. The tunnel narrowed. Pipes crossed overhead before disappearing into darkness beyond the flashlight beams. Water dripped into shallow drains cut into the floor. Each drop landed with quiet precision. Then, nothing. The dripping stopped. Not gradually. All at once. Daniel slowed. So did they... His words barely rose above a whisper. The machines? He nodded. I listened. The pumps had fallen silent. No motors. No distant vibration. Only our breathing remained. The stillness felt strangely complete, as though the tunnels themselves had paused. Daniel switched off his flashlight. Darkness settled around us. I almost asked why. Instead, I noticed something. A faint gray light filtered from somewhere farther ahead. Not bright enough to see clearly. Just enough to soften the edges of the passage. Daniel spoke without turning. Listen. I did. At first, nothing. Then footsteps. Soft, measured, approaching from somewhere beyond the bend ahead. One, then another. Each step landed with calm certainty. Someone was walking toward us. I lifted my flashlight. The beam reached the corner. Empty. The footsteps continued. Closer now. Daniel remained perfectly still. His face showed no surprise, only recognition. The steps stopped only a few feet away. No figure appeared. No voice followed. The quiet returned. Daniel switched his flashlight back on. The first time I heard them, he said, I searched every tunnel. He smiled faintly. I don't search anymore. We continued deeper beneath the dam. The clocks became more frequent. One read midnight. Another nearly noon. One had no hands at all, yet its pendulum moved gently from side to side. I found myself checking my own watch every few minutes. Its second hand had stopped. A moment later, it began moving again, as though nothing had happened. Daniel noticed. They borrow time. I looked at him. What does that mean? I've never figured that out. His answer sounded honest, not mysterious, simply tired. Eventually, we reached the oldest floodgate chamber. The room stretched high above us, disappearing into darkness where thick cables vanished through the ceiling. Massive gears rested along one wall, coated with decades of careful maintenance. Daniel placed his hand against the railing. I spent 22 winters working down here. He looked upward. I've heard voices. I've seen lights. But the footsteps... He paused. They're the only thing that never changed. Neither of us spoke again for several moments. The pumps restarted somewhere deep inside the structure. A slow mechanical rhythm returned. The tunnel almost felt alive again. I breathed easier. We turned toward the exit. The walk back seemed shorter. Perhaps because we no longer stopped. Perhaps because neither of us wanted to. At last a steel door came into view. Its narrow window reflected our flashlight beams. Daniel reached for the handle. Before his hand touched it, the heavy door swung shut. Slowly, deliberately, the latch clicked. Neither of us had made contact. Daniel stared at it without moving. Then he sighed. They do that sometimes. He said it as though commenting on the weather. No fear, no surprise, only acceptance. He unlocked the door with an old brass key hanging around his neck. Cool evening air greeted us as we stepped outside. Behind us, the steel door eased itself closed once more. This time, neither of us looked back. The abandoned pump house stood hidden beyond a line of overgrown spruce trees nearly 2 miles from a main dam. I almost drove past a narrow dirt road leading toward it. Moss covered the broken sign, leaving only a few faded letters behind. Daniel had circled the location on an old map before we parted. If you're going, he told me, go before sunset. I arrived later than I intended. The sky already carried the soft blue-gray color that comes just before evening. The building looked forgotten. Tall weeds reached the cracked windows. Vines climbed the brick walls. The roof sagged beneath years of snow and rain. Yet as I stepped from my truck, I heard it, a low mechanical vibration. Steady, gentle, almost comforting. The pump house still hummed. That made no sense. Power had been disconnected decades earlier, at least according to every record I'd found. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, dust covered the floor except for a narrow path leading toward the rear rooms. The air carried the faint smell of burning wood. Not fresh smoke, something older, like ashes long settled inside forgotten fireplaces. I paused. The scent reminded me of camping trips with my older brother when we were children. He always insisted the fire should burn low before bedtime. Bright flames keep you awake, he'd laugh. I hadn't thought about those nights in years. The memory faded as I walked farther inside. Broken machinery filled the main room. Massive pipes crossed the ceiling before disappearing through cracked walls. The humming continued, never louder, never softer, just present. My flashlight reached a narrow hallway. Paint peeled from every wall. Near the end of the corridor, I stopped. Children's drawings. Hundreds of them. Crayons. Colored pencils. Faded marker. They covered nearly every inch of one wall. Small houses. Trees. Dogs. Families holding hands. Most looked ordinary. Until I noticed one. A drawing of the pump house itself. Someone had colored a tiny figure standing in an upstairs window. I looked up. The real window was empty. I smiled uneasily. Children often imagine strange things. I continued down the hallway. When I glanced back a minute later, the drawing had changed. The small figure no longer stood in the upstairs window. It stood outside, closer to the front door. I frowned. Perhaps I had remembered it wrong. I examined another picture. Then another. Simple scenes. Sunny skies. Blue lakes. Birds flying overhead. Comforting. Harmless. When I turned back toward the first drawing, the figure had moved again. Now it stood beside the building, facing outward. My flashlight trembled slightly. I lowered it, counted slowly to 5, raised it again. The drawing looked ordinary. The figure was gone. Only the pump house remained. A quiet relief settled over me. I laughed once under my breath. Maybe the fading light was playing tricks on my eyes. I left the hallway without looking back. Outside, evening had almost disappeared into night. The humming continued behind the walls. I reached my truck, started the engine, and drove away. It wasn't until I stopped for fuel an hour later that I noticed a folded sheet of paper resting on the passenger seat. A child's drawing. The pump house. The front door standing open. No figure anywhere. Only an empty space where someone seemed to have been. I don't remember picking it up, and I have never been brave enough to return it. That afternoon began with bright sunlight reflecting across the reservoir. The water looked calm enough to invite anyone onto it, and the small rental marina buzzed with quiet conversation. Families loaded coolers into aluminum boats while children tossed pieces of bread toward ducks drifting near the dock. It felt like the kind of peaceful place where frightening stories could never survive. By sunset, almost everyone had gone home. Only a handful of boats remained tied to the weather-wooden pier. The air had grown pleasantly warm, carrying the faint sweetness of crushed reeds drying along the shoreline. It reminded me of summer afternoons when I used to explore marshes behind my uncle's farmhouse. The smell always meant the day was ending. I stood near the end of the dock, watching the fading light settle across the lake. The marina manager locked the rental office before walking toward me. Waiting for someone? I shook my head. Just watching. He looked across the reservoir. That's usually how these stories begin. His words stayed with me after he left. Darkness arrived slowly. The water changed from blue to gray, then almost black beneath the evening sky. Small waves tapped gently against the wooden posts supporting the dock. Somewhere across the reservoir, a loon called once before everything became quiet again. Then I heard an engine, low, steady, approaching from somewhere beyond the darkness. A small rental boat emerged from the middle of the lake. Its navigation light glowed faintly as it drifted toward the marina. The engine continued running. No one sat at the wheel. No one stood inside. The boat reached the dock with surprising care, brushing the rubber bumper so softly it barely made a sound. For several moments, I simply stared. The empty vessel rocked gently against the pier. Its motor idled as though waiting for instructions. The marina manager returned almost immediately, followed by 2 sheriff's deputies who had apparently been called before I noticed them arriving. None of them looked surprised, only concerned. One deputy shut off the engine. The other searched every corner of the boat. Nothing. No wallet. No fishing gear. Only one wet shoe lying near the driver's seat. The leather looked new. Fresh droplets rolled from it onto the floor of the boat. The manager sighed quietly. Another one. Neither deputy answered. Flashlights swept across the dark shoreline, while a rescue team searched the water for hours. They found no signs of anyone. Only gentle ripples spreading beneath the moonlight. Near midnight, permission was given for the boat to be secured until morning. Curiosity kept me there longer than it should have. The marina manager noticed. "You writing all this down?" "Trying to." He nodded toward the boat, then looked at the compass. I climbed aboard carefully. The deck shifted beneath my weight with a soft creak. Inside the console, the small compass rested beneath cracked glass. At first it pointed north. Then it began turning, slowly, without stopping, around once. Then again, its needle circled endlessly as though every direction had disappeared. I tapped the glass. Nothing changed. The night around me felt strangely quiet. Even the gentle movement of the lake seemed to fade. I remember my father's old camping compass. Whenever it behaved strangely, he blamed nearby metal. "This one never lies," he'd always tell me, standing inside that empty boat. I wish his compass had been there instead. The spinning continued, faster now, almost impossible to follow. A breeze crossed the reservoir, carrying the sweet scent of reeds once more. The boat rocked gently, then stopped, perfectly still. The compass froze. Its needle pointed straight down, not north, not south, down, toward the floor beneath my feet. Before I could move, something tapped softly beneath the hull. One knock, gentle enough that I almost questioned whether I'd imagined it. Then another, closer, directly below me. I held my breath. The deputies stood talking farther along the dock, unaware. Another knock came, slow, measured, like someone politely asking to come aboard. I stepped back carefully. The boat shifted beneath me again. The knocking stopped. I climbed onto the dock, without looking into the water beside the hull. The marina manager watched my face. "It heard you." I frowned. "What did?" He looked toward the quiet lake. Instead of answering, he untied the boat from the dock. Without anyone climbing aboard, the empty vessel drifted slowly away from us. No wind pushed it. No current carried it. It simply moved back toward the darkness from which it had returned. Neither of us followed. I never discovered who owned the wet shoe, and I have never answered another knock coming from beneath the water. The drought had lasted longer than anyone expected. By the middle of October, the reservoir had fallen lower than it had in decades. Hillsides that had lived beneath deep water slowly emerged into the sunlight, revealing broken stone walls, old fence posts, and the outlines of roads that had vanished long before I was born. Locals gathered along the shoreline every afternoon. Some searched for forgotten tools. Others simply wanted to see the past rising from the lake. I arrived just before sunset, carrying a notebook and a camera. The evening sky was clear, and the warm light painted exposed earth in shades of gold and brown. Dry grass bent gently in the breeze, carrying the faint scent of aged cloth mixed with cracked timber that had spent years hidden beneath the reservoir. A park ranger met me near the temporary trail leading toward the old village. "Stay on the marked path," he said. "The ground isn't stable." I nodded. He hesitated before turning away. "If you find a staircase." He stopped speaking, then offered a tired smile. "Just don't go too far." I wanted to ask why. Instead, I thanked him and continued alone. The old farmhouse stood nearly half a mile from the present shoreline. Only its stone foundation remained above the dried mud, though enough of the walls survived to show where rooms had once been. Nature had reclaimed much of the place, but there was something strangely untouched about it. As I stepped through the broken doorway, the smell of old fabric lingered in the still air. It reminded me of the cedar chest my mother kept at the foot of her bed, filled with blankets she saved for winter. Every autumn she would open it for the first cold night, and the room would fill with the gentle scent of old cloth and cedar. Standing inside the farmhouse, that memory returned so clearly that I almost expected to hear her calling from another room. Instead, there was only quiet. The floor had long since disappeared, leaving packed earth beneath my boots. Sunlight reached through the missing roof, casting long beams across broken furniture and scattered bricks. Near one wall stood a small wooden table. I wasn't sure how it had survived. Its legs were worn, its surface cracked, yet something rested upon it. A framed family photograph. I picked it up carefully. The glass was clean, perfectly clean. There were no water stains, no warped paper, no fading. A smiling family looked back at me as though the picture had been placed there only yesterday. A father, a mother, 2 young children. Behind them stood the very farmhouse where I now stood alone. I checked the back of the frame. The date read 1958. More than half a century beneath the reservoir should have destroyed it. Instead, it looked untouched by time. A cool breeze entered through the empty doorway. The photograph slipped slightly in my hands. I quickly placed it back on the table. The silence deepened. It wasn't frightening. Not yet, only unusually complete. As I explored farther, I noticed another doorway leading into what had once been the cellar. Stone steps disappeared below the farmhouse. I remembered the ranger's unfinished warning. "If you find a staircase." I stood at the top for several moments. Common sense told me to leave. Curiosity won instead. I switched on my flashlight and began descending. Each step fell dry beneath my boots. Dust floated quietly through the beam of light. The walls narrowed as I reached the bottom. The cellar stretched farther than seemed possible. According to the maps I'd studied, the farmhouse should have ended only a few feet beyond the stairs. Instead, a long corridor extended into darkness. The air grew cooler. The scent of old cloth faded. replaced by the faint smell of dry earth. I stopped walking. The beam of my flashlight barely reached the end of the passage. There, almost beyond the light, a broom leaned against the wall. Old, handmade, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. Then I heard it, a soft brushing sound, back and forth, slow, steady. Someone was sweeping. The sound echoed gently from somewhere deeper in the corridor, not hurried, not hiding, simply continuing a task that should have ended decades ago. I called out, "Hello." The sweeping stopped. Complete silence followed. I waited. Nothing answered. After nearly a minute, I convinced myself it had been loose dirt shifting across the floor. I took one careful step forward. The sweeping began again, closer this time. The rhythm remained calm. Back, then forward, as though whoever held the broom had moved only a little nearer. My flashlight flickered once. Only once. When the beam steadied again, the broom leaning against the wall was gone. The corridor beyond remained empty, yet the gentle brushing sound continued somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Every instinct told me to turn around. Slowly, without taking my eyes from the passage ahead, I climbed the staircase back toward the fading daylight. The sweeping never became louder. It never followed. It simply continued below, patient in a way that made time feel meaningless. Outside, the evening sky had turned deep orange. The ranger stood waiting near the trail. He looked at my face before asking a single question. "You heard it?" I couldn't speak. I only nodded. He looked toward the farmhouse with quiet understanding. They're still keeping the place tidy. Neither of us smiled. As I walked back toward the shore, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The doorway to the cellar stood open, dark, silent. I chose not to wonder who was still cleaning a house that had drowned long ago. The old flood marker stood alone at the end of a forgotten access road, several miles from the main highway. Most people drove past the narrow entrance without noticing it. The wooden sign had faded until only a few letters remained, and tall grass leaned across the cracked pavement, as though trying to hide the place from anyone passing by. I arrived just before sunset on the last evening of October. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and distant flashes of lightning rolled across the mountains, without bringing rain. Each burst of light revealed the outline of the reservoir before everything slipped back into darkness. The air carried a faint metallic scent, like copper warming beneath a storm. The flood marker rose from the ground a short distance from the shoreline. It was taller than I expected. Old white paint clung to the weathered post, marked with faded numbers, showing how high the water had climbed during the Great Flood many years before. Moss covered its base, and wild grass surrounded it in quiet circles. Someone had placed fresh flowers there, white lilies, yellow daisies, a handful of deep red roses. They rested neatly against the wooden post, as though arranged only moments earlier. I knelt beside them. The petals were fresh. Not a single leaf had begun to wilt. I looked around. No houses stood nearby. No cemetery overlooked the lake. The nearest road lay almost a mile away. Yet these flowers had clearly been left with care. An elderly man, carrying a walking stick, appeared farther down the path. His slow footsteps barely disturbed the grass. When he reached the marker, he tipped his hat politely. "You came to see the flowers." It wasn't a question. "I've heard people leave them every year." He nodded. "They do." "For who?" His eyes rested on the reservoir. "No one agrees." His answer lingered between us. The wind shifted gently, carrying the copper scent through the evening once more. The old man smiled sadly. I used to ask the same thing. He touched one of the lilies with careful fingers. After a while, he paused. "You stop asking." Those words reminded me of the retired inspector from the observation deck. There seemed to be a pattern among people who had lived near the reservoir for many years. Eventually, they accepted that some questions remained unanswered. The old man wished me a peaceful evening before disappearing down the trail. I stayed. Darkness settled slowly across the water. The storm remained trapped beyond the mountains, sending only distant flashes of pale light across the sky. Each one illuminated the flood marker for only a heartbeat before leaving it alone again. Hours passed. The temperature dropped. Crickets filled the silence with their quiet song until, little by little, even they fell silent. I checked my watch. A few minutes before midnight. The flowers remained exactly where they had been placed. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. Then the church bell from a distant town echoed faintly across the valley. One slow chime. Midnight. The breeze disappeared. The reservoir became perfectly calm. I noticed movement near the shoreline. Not fast. Not hidden. Someone was walking along the edge of the water. The figure wore a long coat that stirred gently with each step. Their face remained hidden beneath the darkness. They carried no lantern, no flashlight, yet they walked with complete confidence. The figure reached the flood marker and stopped beside the flowers. For several quiet moments, they simply stood there, head bowed, almost as though reading names written on the weather post. Then they knelt, one by one. They gathered every bouquet into their arms. The movements were careful, respectful, not hurried. The flowers never fell. Not a single petal touched the ground. I stayed completely still. Even my breathing seemed too loud. The figure turned toward the reservoir. Without looking in my direction, they walked slowly toward the water's edge. The lake reflected the faint glow of distant lightning. When the figure reached the shoreline, they continued walking, not around the water. Into it, the surface barely rippled. Step by step, they moved deeper until the darkness swallowed them completely. The flowers disappeared with them. Only gentle circles spread across the reservoir before fading into smooth water once again. I waited several minutes before finding the courage to stand. The flood marker remained exactly where it had always been. Empty now. No flowers. No footprints. No sign that anyone had visited. Morning arrived quietly. As the first light reached the valley, another truck pulled onto Forgotten Road. A middle-aged woman stepped out carrying a fresh bundle of white lilies. She smiled politely as she passed me. Without saying a word, she placed the flowers at the base of the marker. Then she returned to her truck and drove away. She never looked toward the lake. She never looked back. I stood there for a long time after she had gone. The storm had finally passed. The metallic scent had vanished. The morning breeze carried only the clean smell of wet grass. I almost convinced myself that the night's visitor had been nothing more than a trick of darkness and exhaustion. Then I noticed something resting beside the flowers. A single drop of water, balanced perfectly on one white petal. It wasn't rain. The skies had remained dry all night. I never returned to the flood marker after that, but every autumn, when the air carries that faint copper scent before a distant storm, I find myself wondering whether someone is placing fresh flowers there or quietly coming back to collect them. The caretaker's apartment sat inside the oldest section of Ashwood Dam, hidden behind a narrow hallway that most visitors never noticed. The room had once belonged to the chief caretaker, a man who had watched over the dam long before computers and security cameras became part of the job. By the time I arrived, late on a gray November afternoon, the hallway windows reflected nothing except the pale sky above the reservoir. The current caretaker unlocked the apartment without saying much. His name was Harold. He had worked at the dam for nearly 25 years, and he carried himself with the quiet patience of someone who had grown used to long days and empty buildings. "The place has been left exactly as it was," he said. "No one wanted to change it." The old key turned with a soft click. The door opened slowly. A warm scent of old paper and faded wallpaper glue drifted into the hallway. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it reminded me of the small public library I visited as a child, where worn books lined every shelf and the pages carried the comforting smell of stories that had been read 100 times before. The apartment felt frozen in another time. A wooden coat rack stood beside the entrance. An old radio rested on a side table. A pair of reading glasses lay open next to yesterday's newspaper. Except the newspaper wasn't from yesterday. It was dated more than 30 years earlier. Dust covered the floor, but the furniture looked strangely untouched. Harold walked into the kitchen. "I make tea whenever I come up here." He filled an old kettle with water from a modern bottle instead of the tap. "I don't trust these pipes anymore." A few minutes later, we sat together at the small kitchen table. Steam curled gently from our cups. The warm tea mixed with the smell of aging books until the apartment felt almost welcoming. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things, the changing seasons, the growing number of visitors, the history of the dam. Then Harold became quiet. He stared into his tea before speaking again. The last caretaker lived here alone. I waited. One morning, he paused. He simply wasn't here anymore. No signs of leaving? Harold shook his head. His coat stayed on the hook. His boots were beside the door. The bed had been slept in, but he was gone. The apartment settled around us with a soft wooden creak. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the windows. No one ever found him? I asked. Not a trace. Harold's answer came almost as a whisper. He carried our empty cups to the sink. Before leaving, he handed me a small lantern. I'll lock the outside door. You want a night here? He gave me a careful look. If you change your mind. He smiled faintly. The key works from the inside. After he left, the apartment became very quiet. I wandered slowly from room to room. The bedroom overlooked the reservoir. An old clock rested on the bedside table. Its hand stopped forever at 3:14. A knitted blanket lay neatly folded across the bed. The sitting room held shelves filled with maintenance journals dating back decades. One notebook rested open on the desk. The final page contained only a single unfinished sentence. The water has been... Nothing followed. No explanation. No final thought. Only those 3 words. Evening slipped into night. I lit the lantern and placed it beside the window. Beyond the glass, the warning lights on the dam blinked steadily against the darkness. The quiet should have been comforting. Instead, it felt as though the apartment were waiting. I made myself a simple meal from the supplies I brought. Read a few pages from one of the old journals. Eventually, sleep found me. When morning light reached the bedroom, I woke to the smell of freshly cooked bacon. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The set reminded me of Sunday mornings at my parents' house. My father always woke before everyone else, humming softly while breakfast filled the kitchen with warmth. Smiling at the memory, I walked into the apartment. Then I stopped. The kitchen table had been set for breakfast. A plate of eggs, fresh bread, a cup of steaming tea, butter neatly spread across 2 slices of toast. The meal looked as though someone had finished cooking only moments earlier. I stared at it for several seconds. The apartment remained completely silent. No footsteps, no opening doors, no voices, only the quiet ticking of my watch. I touched the teacup. It was warm, not merely warm. Hot enough that steam still rose into the morning air. A chair stood slightly pulled away from the table, as though someone had just stood up. I looked through every room. The bedroom, the sitting room, the bathroom. Every window remained locked from the inside. The front door was still bolted exactly as I had left it. No one else was there. A gentle knock echoed from the hallway outside. 3 soft taps. Harold's voice followed. You awake? I opened the door. He smiled. Sleep well. I hesitated before answering. Did you come in earlier? His expression changed. I haven't had this key since last night. I stepped aside. He looked toward the breakfast table. His smile slowly disappeared. Neither of us entered the kitchen. For a long time, we simply stood in the doorway. The tea continued to steam, as though whoever had prepared breakfast expected someone to sit down before it became cold. The overflow tunnel was never meant for visitors. It existed for one purpose alone: to carry excess water safely through the mountain whenever the reservoir rose too high. Most people who came to Ashwood Dam never knew the tunnel was there. It hid behind a heavy steel door at the end of a narrow maintenance corridor, far below the observation deck, where I had first met the retired inspector. I arrived just after 4 in the afternoon. Winter had settled over the valley, covering the distant hills with a pale blanket of frost. The sunlight outside looked bright enough, but beneath the dam everything seemed untouched by the season. The tunnel remained cool all year, its walls damp with tiny beads of moisture that caught the beam of my flashlight like scattered stars. Harold met me at the entrance. You wanted to see the overflow passage, he said. I nodded. He unlocked the door. The hinges gave a slow groan before revealing a long concrete tunnel disappearing into darkness. You can walk to the first inspection gate. He handed me a small flashlight. But don't stay after sunset. Why? He looked into the darkness before answering. Because the tunnel remembers voices. He tried to smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. I thanked him and stepped inside. The heavy door closed quietly behind me. The tunnel stretched farther than I expected, its ceiling arched high overhead while a narrow walkway followed one side of the passage. Far below, a thin stream of water moved steadily toward the river beyond the dam. Every sound echoed longer than it should have. My footsteps returned to me from somewhere ahead, then again from behind. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete, mixed with cool mineral water. Every breath felt clean, almost refreshing, yet the silence around me carried an unusual weight. I walked slowly. Every few yards, faded yellow lights hung from the ceiling. Most no longer worked. Only my flashlight reached into the darkness beyond them. As I rounded the first bend, I heard someone whisper. At first, I thought it was only the echo of my own breathing. Then I heard it again, soft, gentle, too distant to understand. I stopped walking. The whisper stopped too. The silence returned. I laughed quietly to myself. Old tunnels often played tricks with sound. That was the reasonable explanation. I continued forward. The tunnel narrowed slightly, forcing the echoes closer together. A small draft brushed gently across my face, even though the large ventilation fans above me stood perfectly still. I looked up. Not one of them was moving, yet the cool air continued passing through the tunnel. It carried no smell, only the feeling of something quietly passing by. My grandmother used to tell me that unexpected breezes sometimes carried forgotten memories. Whenever a window opened by itself, she would pause her sewing and smile softly, saying someone old had come to visit for a little while. I hadn't thought about that in years. The memory stayed with me as I reached the first inspection platform. A metal railing overlooked the narrow water channel below. Beyond it, the tunnel disappeared into darkness once again. I rested my notebook against the railing and wrote down a few observations. The date, the weather, the strange airflow. Nothing unusual, nothing impossible. Then someone spoke. Not loudly, barely above a whisper. Ace! My hand froze. Only one person had ever called me that. My older brother. It had been his nickname for me since childhood. No one else used it. Not friends. Not family. Not even my parents. He had stopped saying it years before he moved overseas. Yet the voice had sounded exactly like his. I turned slowly. The tunnel behind me stood empty. My flashlight reached all the way back to the bend I had just passed. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. I waited. Perhaps another visitor had entered. Perhaps the echo had changed an ordinary sound into something familiar. That explanation lasted only a few seconds. The whisper came again. Ace! Closer now. Gentle. Patient. Coming from somewhere deep ahead. Not behind me. I swallowed. Every sensible part of my mind insisted there had to be another explanation. Even so, I found myself speaking into the darkness. Who's there? The tunnel answered with silence. Then another voice. This one softer. Older. Almost impossible to hear. It repeated the same nickname. Ace! The sound drifted slowly through the passage before fading away. I took one careful step backward. Then another. My flashlight flickered once. The beam dimmed before returning. I tightened my grip around it. The tunnel suddenly felt much longer than before. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every echo lasted just a little too long. I turned toward the exit and began walking without rushing. There was no reason to panic, no reason to run. The whispers remained behind me, quiet, unhurried, as though they already knew where I was going. Halfway back, my flashlight flickered again. This time it stayed dim. I struck the side gently with my palm. The beam brightened, then faded. The battery should have been new. The light shrank until only a small circle remained ahead of me. I could finally see the steel exit door in the distance. Relief settled into my chest. One more flicker. Darkness. The flashlight died completely. For a single heartbeat, the tunnel became utterly black. Then, another voice answered from somewhere only a few feet away. Not my brother's. Not anyone I recognized. Just one quiet sentence. "You came back." The flashlight sprang to life. The tunnel stood empty. The exit door waited exactly where it had before. I didn't stop walking again. Harold was standing outside when I pushed open the heavy door. He looked at my face for only a moment. "You heard someone." It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. He closed the door behind me. The lock clicked into place. Neither of us spoke as we climbed the stairs toward daylight. Somewhere beyond the steel door, deep inside the overflow tunnel, I thought I heard someone whisper my childhood nickname one last time. This time, I chose not to answer. The forgotten picnic ground rested on a quiet ridge overlooking the northern end of the reservoir. It had once been one of the most popular places in the valley, long before the old town disappeared beneath the rising water. By the time I found it, late one November afternoon, nature had almost reclaimed everything people had left behind. A narrow trail led through towering cedar trees. Their branches blocked most of the fading sunlight, leaving only scattered patches of pale light across the forest floor. The air carried the clean scent of pine needles mixed with a faint trace of old charcoal from fire pits that had not been used in decades. The place felt peaceful, almost welcoming. An old wooden sign stood beside the entrance. Its lettering faded beyond recognition. Moss covered the lower half, and vines wrapped gently around one corner, as though trying to protect it from time. I walked slowly between the broken picnic tables. Most had collapsed years earlier. Others leaned at odd angles beneath blankets of fallen leaves. My boots made little sound on the soft forest floor. The quiet reminded me of childhood camping trips with my parents. My mother always insisted we leave every campsite cleaner than we found it. Before driving home, she would gather every scrap of paper and every forgotten cup. "Someone else deserves a peaceful place too," she used to say, standing among the abandoned tables. I wondered when anyone had last cared for this place. Near the center of the clearing stood an old stone fireplace. The metal cooking grate had rusted away, leaving only blackened stones arranged in a rough circle. The faint smell of long-faded charcoal still lingered there, as though the final fire had never completely disappeared. I knelt beside it. Half buried beneath dry leaves lay a small leather photo album. Its cover had cracked with age, yet the pages inside remained remarkably dry. Curious, I opened it. The first photograph showed a family smiling beside the very fireplace where I now knelt. Children laughed while adults prepared food on a bright summer afternoon. The reservoir glittered behind them. Everything looked ordinary. The next picture showed another family. Different faces, different clothes, a different decade. Yet one detail remained exactly the same. Near the edge of the photograph stood a little girl wearing a pale blue dress. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking toward the trees. I frowned. Perhaps she belonged to that family. I turned another page. A group of teenagers posed beside the old picnic tables. The years had clearly changed. Cars in the background looked newer. The tables appeared freshly painted. But there she was again, the same little girl, the same blue dress, the same quiet expression. She stood several yards behind the group. No one else seemed to notice her. A cool breeze stirred the cedar branches overhead. The pages of the album fluttered gently before settling again. I turned to another photograph. A wedding celebration. Music, flowers, smiling guests. The little girl appeared once more, standing beside a tree, unchanged, exactly the same. I closed the album. My hands felt colder than before. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps someone had added the same figure to each picture as a joke. Perhaps I was imagining the resemblance. Even so, something urged me to look again. This time I examined her face more carefully. The small nose, the gentle smile, the loose strands of dark hair falling across one side of her face. Recognition settled slowly, not because I knew her, because I had seen her before. She was a child from the drawings inside the abandoned pump house. The same face, the same blue dress, only now she looked directly at the camera. I felt a quiet chill pass through me. Without thinking, I looked toward the trees surrounding the clearing. Nothing moved. Only cedar branches swayed gently above the fallen leaves. The forest remained silent. I slipped the album into my backpack. Perhaps someone at the local museum could explain it. As I stood, I noticed another object resting beneath one of the picnic tables. A small metal lunchbox. Its faded paint showed cartoon animals playing beside a lake. Inside rested a folded piece of paper. It was a child's drawing. Crayon lines colored a bright summer sky. Families gathered around the fireplace. Birds flew overhead. Near the edge of the page stood the little girl once again. This time she wasn't alone. Someone had drawn another child beside her. The second figure had been erased so many times that only faint pencil marks remained. I stared at the drawing. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Not fear, sadness, as though someone had tried very hard to remember a face they could no longer see. The sun slipped lower behind the mountains. The clearing grew noticeably darker. I decided it was time to leave. Halfway back to the trail, I realized the forest had become completely still. No birds called from the branches. No insects moved through the grass. Even the breeze had disappeared. The silence felt complete. I glanced over my shoulder. At the far end of the picnic ground, beside the old fireplace, a small figure stood quietly between the cedar trees. A pale blue dress, dark hair resting against narrow shoulders. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking toward the empty picnic tables, as though waiting for people who had promised to return. I blinked. The clearing stood empty once more. Only the stone fireplace remained beneath the fading light. I didn't walk back. I continued toward the trail, without hurrying. When I finally reached my truck, I opened the photo album one last time. Every photograph remained exactly as before, except the final page. The little girl was gone. Only smiling families filled the picture now. As I closed the album, one small pine needle slipped from between its pages. It carried the fresh scent of cedar, though I was certain none had fallen inside while I was there. The dock was older than the dam itself. Long before the valley became a reservoir, small fishing boats tied themselves to its weathered posts. Most of the original town now rested beneath hundreds of feet of water, but the dock had survived because it stood on higher ground. It stretched quietly into the deepest part of the lake, where the water changed from green to almost black within only a few yards. I arrived just before midnight. The moon hung low above the mountains, covering the reservoir with a silver glow that made every gentle ripple shimmer. A cool current drifted beneath the dock, carrying tiny flower petals across the surface. White blossoms, pink blossoms, a few deep purple ones. They floated past one after another, though there were no flowering trees anywhere along that shore. I leaned against the old railing, though it felt smooth beneath my hand after years of wind and rain. An elderly diver had given me directions to this place earlier that afternoon. Before leaving, he looked at me with quiet eyes and spoke only one sentence. "If you hear the bell," he paused, "don't count how many times it rings." I almost smiled. Instead, I thanked him. Now, standing alone beneath the moonlight, I found myself remembering those words more often than I wanted. The petals continued drifting beneath the dock. Some moved quickly. Others seemed to pause before quietly continuing downstream. Watching them reminded me of spring mornings with my mother. She loved pressing flowers between the pages of old books, believing every blossom deserved one last season before it faded away. Whenever I smell fresh petals, I think of her. The memory stayed with me as I listened to the quiet water. Time passed slowly. The lake remained calm. No boats crossed the reservoir. No lights shone from distant cabins. Even the breeze seemed content to leave the water undisturbed. I checked my watch. 12 minutes after midnight. Nothing. For a moment, I wondered if the diver's story belonged among the many local legends that grew larger each time someone repeated them. Then, a single bell rang. The sound rose gently from somewhere beneath the water. Deep, clear, soft enough that I almost believed I had imagined it. The note drifted across the reservoir before slowly disappearing into mountains. I waited. The diver's warning echoed quietly inside my thoughts. Don't count. So I didn't. The lake returned to silence. The flower petals continued floating beneath the dock as though nothing unusual had happened. I breathed a little easier. Perhaps there had been an old church farther down the valley. Perhaps sound simply carried well across the water at night. Then another bell answered. Not louder. Closer. Its tone felt older somehow, as though it had traveled a very long distance before reaching me. I gripped the railing. The water beneath the dock remained perfectly dark. No ripples. No bubbles. Only the slow movement of drifting petals. I forced myself to look toward the opposite shore. Nothing. The mountain stood quietly beneath the moon. A shooting star across the sky before fading into darkness. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, except the sound. It came again, gentle, patient, never hurried. I closed my eyes. Without meaning to, I almost began counting. 1. I stopped myself. The warning returned. Don't count. Instead, I listened. Each tone seemed to linger a little longer than the one before. Not because it had become louder, because the silence around it had grown deeper. My flashlight rested beside my feet. I picked it up and aimed the beam toward the water. The light disappeared beneath the surface after only a few feet. Beyond that, only darkness. Then I noticed something drifting upward. Not quickly, almost gracefully. A handful of flower petals rose from below instead of floating down with the current. White petals, fresh, unbroken. They reached the surface without disturbing the water, one by one, as though released by invisible hands beneath the lake. The beam of my flashlight trembled slightly. I lowered it. The petals gathered beside the dock, forming a loose circle. They remained there for several quiet moments. Then the bell sounded again. This time, something answered. Not another bell. A voice. Soft. Too distant to understand. It didn't echo. It simply drifted upward through the water, like a memory that had forgotten where it belonged. I held my breath. The voice faded almost immediately. Only the lake remained. The petals slowly separated, carried away by a current I could no longer see. I should have left. Instead, curiosity held me in place. I knelt beside the edge of the dock. The moon reflected clearly on the surface. So did my face. Then another reflection appeared, not beside mine. Beneath it, someone stood directly below the dock, looking upward through the dark water. I couldn't see a face, only the outline of a person standing where no one could possibly stand. They remained perfectly still, watching, waiting. I closed my eyes, counted 3 slow breaths. When I looked again, the reflection had disappeared. Only the moon remained. The lake felt ordinary once more, almost peaceful. I gathered my notebook and flashlight. As I turned toward the shore, one final bell echoed quietly beneath the water. I didn't look back. The diver had never told me what happened to those who counted the bells. After that night, I decided I never wanted to find out. The warning tower stood alone in the middle of the reservoir. People called it the lighthouse, even though no ships had ever sailed these waters. Years ago, before the valley was flooded, it warned workers about rising water. Now it remained disconnected from electricity, abandoned for decades. Yet every few nights, its light returned. I reached the shoreline just after sunset. The wind carried the faint scent of river moss drying beneath the fading sky. Across the dark water, the tower stood silent against the mountains. Then the light flashed. Once, a slow white beam swept across the reservoir before disappearing again. I checked the old maintenance records in my backpack. The power cables had been removed nearly 20 years earlier. The tower should have been dark. Another flash. The beam passed across the trees, then across the empty shoreline, then toward me. I looked away until it faded. When darkness returned, I looked back at the tower. Someone was standing beside it, only a small figure, too far away to recognize. The light turned again. Another slow sweep. When it passed over the water and disappeared, the figure had moved closer. Not much, only a few steps. I told myself it had to be another visitor, someone walking the shoreline. The beam returned. Its pale light crossed the lake in complete silence. For a brief moment, everything around me glowed silver. Then darkness came back. The figure stood closer again. There were no footsteps, no splashes, only less distance between us. My hands tightened around the railing. The wind stopped. Even the water seemed unwilling to move. Another flash. The beam reached my feet. I closed my eyes until it passed. When I opened them, the figure stood only a short distance away. Its face remained hidden. Its clothes stirred gently in the night air. It never hurried. It simply waited for the light to turn again. I remembered something the retired inspector once told me. Not everything near the reservoir wants to be found. The lighthouse flashed one final time. Its bright circle swept across the shore. I looked down without thinking. Just for a second. When I raised my eyes again, the shoreline was empty. The figure had disappeared. Slowly, I looked across the water. The lighthouse stood dark once more. No light, no movement, only quiet. I left before the beam had another chance to return. Sometimes, while driving home after sunset, I catch a single white flash in my rearview mirror. I never check whether it's behind me. Some lights are safer when they remain unfollowed. Cabin 17 sat higher than every other ranger cabin around the reservoir. It overlooked the upper water where the forest grew thick and the hiking trails slowly disappeared into the mountains. Rangers had stopped using the cabin years earlier after a landslide blocked the old access road. The building remained standing, forgotten beneath towering pines and quiet skies. I arrived late one November afternoon. The climb took nearly an hour. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had begun sinking behind the hills, painting the windows with soft orange light. The front door stood unlocked. Inside, the air carried the dry scent of cracked cedar mixed with old dust. A small cast-iron stove rested in one corner, while a narrow bed sat beneath a window overlooking the reservoir far below. The place felt empty, not abandoned, simply waiting. I unpacked my notebook and lantern before exploring the small rooms. There wasn't much to see. A kitchen with faded cupboards, a bookshelf holding a few weathered hiking guides, an old desk with every drawer left slightly open. As I closed the last drawer, I noticed something inside. A journal. Its leather cover was worn smooth by years of use. Across the front, written in faded ink, were two simple words. Field notes. I opened it. The first pages described ordinary ranger work. Trail repairs, weather reports, wildlife sightings. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed the date. Tomorrow. I frowned. Someone must have written the wrong year. I kept reading. The first sentence made me stop. Tomorrow afternoon, a stranger carrying a green notebook will arrive at cabin 17. I looked down. The notebook resting beside my lantern was green. A slow breath escaped my lips. I turned another page. He will stand by the east window for several minutes before opening this journal. Without thinking, I looked toward the window. That was exactly where I had been standing only moments earlier. A quiet uneasiness settled over the room. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps another visitor had stayed here before me. Perhaps they had guessed what future travelers might do. The next page read, "He won't believe the first entry." I smiled nervously. "No," I whispered. "I don't." The cabin answered with silence. Outside, daylight slowly faded into evening. I lit the lantern and made a simple dinner while trying not to think about the journal waiting on the desk. The cedar walls creaked softly as the temperature dropped. The sound reminded me of the old farmhouse where my grandfather lived. Winter nights always filled that house with gentle wooden noises. He used to laugh whenever I asked about them. "Old homes like to stretch," he'd say. Remembering his voice helped calm me. After dinner, curiosity returned. I opened the journal again. The handwriting remained neat, steady, almost careful. At exactly 8:43, he will hear 3 knocks on the front door. I glanced at my watch. 8:41. I closed the journal. This was ridiculous. Someone had written these pages years ago. Nothing more. 1 minute passed. Then another. At 8:43, 3 soft knocks echoed through the cabin. Not loud, just enough to be heard. I froze. The knocks didn't come again. Slowly, I walked to the front door and looked through the small window. The porch stood empty. Moonlight covered the trees. Nothing moved. I opened the door. Cold mountain air greeted me. No footprints marked the dusty porch. No one stood among the pines. Only the distant reservoir reflected the stars. I closed the door quietly. Back inside, the journal lay exactly where I had left it. The next page waited open. He opened the door. My hands felt strangely cold. I hadn't turned that page. I knew I hadn't. The lantern flickered gently. I read on. Soon he will wonder who wrote these notes. He'll assume it was another ranger. He'll be wrong. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I turned to the final page. Only one sentence had been written there. Do not read tomorrow. I stared at those words for a long time. Eventually, exhaustion overcame curiosity. I placed the journal back inside the drawer and climbed into bed. Sleep came slowly. When morning arrived, sunlight filled the cabin with quiet warmth. For a while, everything felt ordinary again. I packed my belongings, closed my backpack, reached for my green notebook. Something slipped from between its pages. A folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting matched the journal perfectly. It contained only today's date, and a detailed description of everything I had done since waking up. The final sentence hadn't been completed. The ink stopped halfway across the page, as though whoever had been writing was waiting for me to finish the day. The broken marina rested on the eastern side of the reservoir, where very few visitors ever traveled. Years ago, it had been filled with fishing boats and laughter during the summer months. Now only weathered docks remained, their boards faded by years of rain and winter snow. I arrived just before sunrise. The morning sky carried only a faint hint of color, and a thin layer of mist rested above the quiet water. The old parking lot had nearly disappeared beneath weeds. A rusted sign leaned against a fence, its faded letters barely spelling the word marina. No other cars were there, only mine. As I stepped on the floating dock, the old boards creaked softly beneath my boots. Thick ropes, worn smooth by countless seasons, remained tied to empty posts. They carried the faint smell of salt, though this reservoir had always been fresh water. That strange detail stayed with me. It reminded me of a family vacation to the coast when I was 12. I could still remember standing beside the ocean before sunrise, breathing the salty air while my father skipped stones across the waves. The ropes smelled exactly the same, yet the sea was hundreds of miles away. The water beside the dock remained perfectly calm. Not a single ripple disturbed its smooth surface. Even the floating platforms barely moved. As dawn slowly brightened the sky, I noticed something unusual. Every remaining boat pointed in exactly the same direction. Old fishing boats, small aluminum rentals, a forgotten sailboat with torn canvas. All of them faced toward the deepest part of the reservoir. None faced the shore. I walked farther along the dock, studying each vessel. Their ropes hung loose enough that the boat should have drifted naturally over time. Instead, every bow remained fixed toward open water. It looked almost intentional, as though they had all been waiting for something. An elderly groundskeeper appeared from a small maintenance shed carrying a broom. He noticed me studying the boats. They always do that. His voice was calm. The wind? I asked. He smiled faintly. There isn't enough wind. He swept a few fallen leaves from the dock before continuing. Every morning they're facing the same way. Does someone move them? I used to think so. He rested both hands on the broom handle. I stopped checking. His answer sounded strangely familiar. So many people around the reservoir had reached the same quiet acceptance. They stopped asking. They stopped searching. They simply lived beside the mystery. The groundskeeper wished me a peaceful morning before disappearing back toward the parking lot. I continued walking alone. Near the end of the longest dock floated a small wooden boat. Unlike the others, its paint remained surprisingly well preserved. Its rope stretched loosely from the post. As I stepped closer, I noticed muddy footprints inside. One, then another. They began near the middle bench, crossed the floor, stopped beside the bow. There were no returning prints, only the ones leading forward. I looked over the side. The water beneath the boat remained perfectly clear. Nothing floated below. No branches, no weeds, only the quiet depth of the reservoir. Without thinking, I untied the rope. The knot slipped free more easily than I expected. The boat drifted only a few inches from the dock before stopping on its own. There was no breeze, no current. Still, it seemed unwilling to leave. I climbed aboard carefully, though it gave a soft groan beneath my weight. The boat remained steady, almost welcoming. I sat quietly for several moments. The marina disappeared into complete silence. No birds, no insects, only my own breathing. Then, very gently, the boat turned by itself. Not quickly, not violently. It rotated until its bow faced the same distant point as every other boat in the marina. The movement stopped. I looked toward the horizon. There was nothing there, only open water touched by the first rays of sunlight. A strange sadness settled over me. Not fear, something quieter, as though every boat had spent years waiting for someone who never returned. I tied the rope back exactly as I had found it. Before leaving, I glanced toward the wooden boat one last time. The muddy footprints were gone. The floorboards looked clean, as though no one had stepped inside for many years. I walked back without looking over the water again. Some places keep their visitors. Others simply wait for them. Winter arrived early that year. The mountains surrounding the reservoir wore fresh snow, while the valley below remained cold and gray. I had returned to Ashwood Dam, hoping to speak with a few retired workers before the roads became difficult to travel. Instead, the siren sounded. It happened just after 2 in the afternoon. The sky was perfectly clear. Sunlight reflected brightly from the reservoir. There were no storm clouds, no signs of flooding. Yet the emergency warning echoed across the valley with a deep, mournful cry that seemed to roll from one mountain to the next. Everyone heard it. I expected people to panic. Instead, the people in town calmly stopped what they were doing. A woman closed her bakery window. A mechanic quietly lowered the garage door. Children playing outside gathered their bicycles without being called. One by one, curtains closed, front doors locked. Within 3 minutes, the street stood empty. I found only one man remaining outside. He sat on a wooden bench overlooking the reservoir, his hands folded across an old walking cane. "You should go inside," I said. He shook his head. "It isn't for us." The siren continued, long, steady, never changing its tone. "What does it mean?" He watched the distant dam. "It means they're opening the gates. But there isn't any flood. There doesn't have to be." His answer left me with more questions than before. A cold breeze drifted through the empty street. It carried the faint scent of approaching snow. Not fresh snow, the kind of crisp smell that always arrives hours before the first flakes begin to fall. The strange thing was, the weather forecast had promised sunshine all week. I looked toward the mountains. The sky remained cloudless. No snow, no storm, only the endless sound of the warning siren. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No emergency vehicles appeared. No announcements came over the radio. Everything remained strangely ordinary, except the silence. Every house stayed closed. Every curtain remained drawn. I walked toward the observation deck, overlooking the dam. The parking lot stood empty. The reservoir below reflected the bright afternoon sky. The floodgates remained shut. Nothing was being released. Then why had the siren sounded? As I leaned against the railing, I noticed movement far below. Along the narrow maintenance road, crossing the dam, a line of people walked slowly toward the opposite side. They wore long coats in different colors. Some appeared young, others old. None carried bags. None looked at one another. They walked in complete silence. I counted nearly 20 before they disappeared beneath the concrete structure. The road became empty again. I hurried toward the nearest security office. Locked. Every window, every door. No workers. No guards. Only the siren continued calling across the valley. After nearly 20 minutes, it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. Within moments, doors around town began opening. People returned to sweeping porches. Children rode bicycles again. The mechanic lifted his garage door. No one spoke about what had happened. It was as though nothing unusual had interrupted the afternoon. I returned to the old man on the bench. He smiled when he saw me. You stayed outside. I saw people walking across the dam. His expression became thoughtful. So you finally saw them. Who were they? He looked toward the reservoir. I don't know. Nobody does. He stood slowly and adjusted his coat. But every time the siren calls... He paused. They always answer. He walked away before I could ask another question. That evening, light snow finally began to fall, just enough to cover the ground. The next morning, I visited the maintenance road where I had seen the silent procession. Fresh snow covered everything, except one narrow path. A line of footprints crossed the dam, perfectly clear, leading toward the center. None of them came back. The hillside cemetery overlooked the western edge of the reservoir, where the mountains opened into a wide valley, before disappearing beneath the water. It was one of the oldest burial grounds in the county, built years after the original cemetery had been flooded when the dam was completed. I arrived just after sunrise in early December. A thin layer of frost covered the grass, sparkling beneath the first light of morning. Every step across the narrow path released a clean scent of fresh dew, and the cold air carried only the quiet rustle of bare branches overhead. It was peaceful enough that I almost forgot why I had come. The caretaker met me beside the entrance gate. His heavy coat looked older than I was, and a worn pair of leather gloves rested in his hands. He greeted me with a polite nod before returning to the flower bed he had been tending. You've come because of the stories. It wasn't a question. I've heard there are 2 cemeteries. There are. He looked toward the reservoir, one above the water. He paused, and one beneath it. The words settled between us. When they built the dam, he continued, most families move their loved ones here. Most? His expression grew distant. Not every grave could be reached in time. He said nothing more. I thanked him and wandered among the rows of weathered headstones. Each one faced away from the reservoir. At first, I assumed it had been designed that way for practical reasons. Then I noticed something unusual. Near the oldest corner of the cemetery, one headstone faced the lake. It stood completely alone. The grass around it looked freshly disturbed, as though someone had recently turned it. I walked toward it. The stone itself wasn't remarkable. Simple gray granite. No flowers. No photographs. Only a name worn nearly smooth by decades of wind. Before I could read it, I heard the caretaker behind me. It wasn't like that yesterday. I turned. He stood several yards away. You mean? He nodded. It used to face the others. Neither of us moved. The morning remained perfectly still. A flock of birds crossed the sky without making a sound. I looked back at the stone. It seemed almost intentional. Not broken. Not pushed by weather. Simply turned. The caretaker rubbed his gloves together. My grandfather worked here. He used to say the stone should never look toward the water. Why? He never explained. His voice remained calm. Only that if one ever did. He stopped. I should leave it alone. He returned to his work without another word. I remained beside the strange grave. The sunlight slowly climbed higher, warming the frost until tiny drops of water shimmered across the grass. Something caught my eye. Fresh footprints. They began beside the turned headstone, crossed a narrow path, ended at the edge of the hill overlooking the reservoir. There were no returning prints, only those leading toward the water. Curiosity carried me forward. The hillside ended at a simple wooden fence. Beyond it, the reservoir stretched quietly beneath the winter sky. The water reflected the clouds so perfectly that the surface looked almost solid. I rested my hands on the fence, though it felt cold beneath my fingers. My grandmother used to visit cemeteries every spring, carrying fresh flowers for relatives I had never met. She always believed the living owed the dead one quiet conversation each year. Standing above the reservoir, I found myself speaking softly, not to anyone in particular, only to the silence. The breeze answered first. Gentle, cold, then, very faintly, I heard another sound, not from behind me, from below, a shovel, slowly moving through soil. One careful scoop, Then another. I looked around. The cemetery stood empty. The caretaker remained far across the hill, trimming winter branches. The sound came again, muted, steady, as though someone far beneath the reservoir continued digging where no earth should have remained. It lasted only a few moments before fading completely. I told myself it had been construction somewhere across the valley. An echo, nothing more. Yet when I returned to the turned headstone, something had changed. A small bouquet of fresh white flowers rested at its base. I was certain they hadn't been there before. Their petals still carried tiny drops of morning dew. No footsteps surrounded them. No tire tracks reached the cemetery road. Only the flowers, quietly waiting. The caretaker noticed them too. He lowered his eyes, without surprise, without fear. They always appear after the first frost. He spoke almost gently. No one knows who brings them. I didn't ask another question. Some answers seemed unnecessary. Before leaving, I glanced back one final time. Every headstone faced away from the reservoir, except one. The lonely stone remained turned toward the water, watching, not as though it feared what rested beneath the lake, but as though it remembered someone who never came home. I drove away before noon. As the cemetery disappeared in my rearview mirror, I caught myself checking the reflection one last time. The turned headstone was no longer visible, whether it had been hidden by distance or quietly facing the others again. I chose not to find out. The old security office overlooked the floodgates from the highest point of Ashwood Dam. Before cameras watched every corner of the reservoir, a single watchman spent each night inside that small building, recording every visitor, every passing truck, and every unusual sound that drifted across the water. The office had been empty for nearly 30 years. I arrived on a cold afternoon just before sunset. Fresh snow from the previous night covered the mountain peaks, while the valley below remained clear beneath a pale winter sky. The narrow path leading to the office was lined with weathered railings, their paint peeling after decades of wind and rain. The building was smaller than I expected. Its windows overlooked the floodgates, giving the watchman a clear view of the entire dam. Dust rested across every shelf inside, untouched except for a single narrow trail leading toward an old wooden desk. The front door opened with surprising ease. Inside, the room carried the dry scent of aging mixed with brittle paper that had rested undisturbed for years. A coat still hung beside the entrance. A pair of cracked binoculars waited on the windowsill. An enamel coffee mug rested beside them. It looked as though the watchman had only stepped outside for a moment. Sunlight entered through the large window, catching tiny specks of dust that drifted lazily through the quiet room. I remember my first visit to the observation deck with a retired inspector. He had once told me, a good watchman notices what everyone else forgets. At the time, I thought he was talking about the reservoir. Now I wasn't so sure. The wooden desk held several logbooks stacked neatly beside one another. Curiosity led me to the newest one. Its cover was faded, but the pages remained surprisingly well preserved. Each line recorded a date, a time, the weather, the number of visitors crossing the dam. The handwriting stayed steady from page to page. Then it simply stopped, halfway through a sentence. No explanation, no final signature, just empty pages waiting to be filled. I turned farther ahead. Near the back of the book, writing appeared again. Only this time, the date caught my attention. Tomorrow. I frowned. The entry described clear skies, light wind, and one visitor arriving shortly before sunset. I smiled to myself. Someone must have written in unused pages years after the office closed. Then I reached the next line. Visitor, me. My smile disappeared. The description continued. He will carry a green notebook with worn corners. I looked at the notebook tucked beneath my arm. Its corners were worn exactly as described. He will stand by the east window before reading this page. Slowly, I looked toward the window. That was where I had been standing only moments earlier. A cold feeling settled quietly into my chest. Not panic, only the uneasy realization that someone had described my afternoon before I had lived it. I closed the book, walked to the window. Outside, the reservoir reflected the fading light of evening. Everything appeared peaceful. The floodgates remained closed. No workers cross the dam. No vehicles pass below. Only the vast water stretched toward the distant mountains. Then something moved. Far below, a lone figure walked across the top of the dam. The person wore a long dark coat and moved at an unhurried pace. When they reached the center, they stopped. Even from that distance, I had the strange feeling they were looking directly toward the security office. Toward me. I blinked. The figure was gone. The dam stood empty again. The silence returned. Behind me, a page turned. I spun around. The logbook lay open on the desk. I was certain I had closed it. A fresh line had appeared beneath the last entry. He noticed a window before the window noticed him. The handwriting matched every other page. Steady, careful, unmistakably old. I stepped backward. The room felt smaller now. The fading sunlight no longer reached the corners. The office seemed to be settling around me with quiet patience. I decided it was time to leave. I reached for the door handle. It wouldn't move. I tried again. The latch remained locked. I was certain I hadn't turned it. I pushed harder. Nothing. The room stayed silent. No footsteps outside. No wind against the windows. Only my own breathing. Then, very softly, the binoculars resting on the windowsill tipped forward. They landed gently on the desk without breaking. One lens pointed toward the open logbook. The other toward the door. I stood perfectly still. After several long moments, the latch gave a quiet click. The handle turned easily beneath my hand. The door opened onto the cold evening air. I stepped outside without looking back. Snow began falling as I walked down the path. Large, slow flakes drifted across the reservoir. By the time I reached my truck, the office windows had almost disappeared behind the white curtain of winter. I opened my notebook before driving home. Tucked between two blank pages was a small slip of yellow paper. I had never seen it before. On it, in the same careful handwriting as the logbook, were just 6 words. Your name appears again next winter. I folded the note carefully. I never returned to the watchman's office. But every winter, when the first snow begins to fall over the reservoir, I find myself wondering whether another page has already been written. The drought returned 3 years after my first visit to Ashwood Reservoir. It lasted through the summer and well into autumn, lowering the water farther than anyone could remember. News crews came to photograph the cracked shoreline, but they stayed close to the roads and left before nightfall. I waited. There was something I wanted to see. The retired inspector had once mentioned that when the reservoir became quiet enough, the old village sometimes found its way back into the moonlight. I didn't ask what he meant. Some stories revealed themselves only when they were ready. I reached the overlook just after midnight. The moon was full, hanging low above the mountains like a lantern someone had forgotten to extinguish. Its pale light stretched across the exposed lake bed, revealing rooftops that had slept beneath the reservoir for generations. The sight stole my breath. Stone chimneys rose from the earth. Broken fences traced forgotten property lines. A narrow street wound between silent homes, exactly as it must have looked before the valley disappeared beneath the rising water. The air carried the dry scent of cracked clay mixed with the fading sweetness of old orchards. Somewhere, long ago, apples had grown here. For a moment, I imagined children running between the trees, while families prepared supper inside warm kitchens. The silence made those thoughts feel strangely close. I climbed carefully down the old shoreline until my boots touched the village road. The ground felt firm beneath me, not muddy, not soft, as though the place had been waiting patiently beneath the water all these years. The first house I passed had no roof. Moonlight poured through empty windows and rested quietly across the floor. Inside, a wooden rocking horse lay on its side. One wheel was missing. I remembered the toy horse my father built for my younger sister when we were children. She loved it so much that she cried the day she finally grew too tall to ride it. That memory warmed me for only a moment. The village quickly reclaimed my attention. Every front door stood open, not broken, not forced, simply open. Each doorway looked like an invitation, or perhaps a farewell that had never ended. I walked slowly along the empty street. The houses remained silent. Curtains no longer covered the windows. Gardens had become patches of dry grass. A rusted bicycle leaned against a porch where no footsteps had echoed for decades. Then I noticed something unusual. A porch light. It glowed softly at the far end of the road. Impossible. There was no electricity here. The old power lines had vanished beneath the reservoir long ago, yet the warm light remained. Steady, gentle, almost welcoming. Curiosity carried me toward it. The house was small. Its white paint had faded almost completely, leaving only weatherwood beneath the moonlight. The front door stood open like all the others. Warm yellow light spilled quietly across the porch. I stopped at the bottom step. The silence around the house felt different. Not empty, occupied. I could smell fresh bread. The scent drifted from somewhere inside, carrying with it memories of my grandmother's kitchen. She used to bake every Saturday morning, filling the whole house with warmth before anyone else woke. For a heartbeat, I forgot where I was. Then I heard a chair move, very softly, inside the house. I stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards gave a quiet creak beneath my boots. The doorway waited only a few feet away. I told myself I would look inside. Only for a moment, nothing more. The sitting room appeared untouched by time. A small fireplace, a wooden table, books resting neatly upon a shelf. A kettle sat beside the hearth. Thin wisps of steam rose gently from its spout. Someone had made tea. Recently. I looked into the next room. No one. The kitchen remained empty. The bedroom beyond stood neatly arranged. The bed had been made with careful hands. Everything felt lived in, everything except the silence. On the dining table rested a single photograph. I picked it up. A family smiled back at me from their front porch. Behind them stood the very house where I now stood. An elderly woman, a young couple, a little girl wearing a pale blue dress. My heart slowed. I had seen her before, in the abandoned pump house, among the old photographs at the picnic ground. She looked exactly the same. She always had. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned quickly. The room stood empty. Yet the rocking chair beside the fireplace moved gently once, then settled. The kettle continued to steam. I placed the photograph back where I had found it. Without another glance, I stepped onto the porch. The moon had climbed higher into the sky. The village looked peaceful, almost beautiful. As I walked back toward the shoreline, I looked over my shoulder one final time. Every house remained dark, except one. The small porch light still glowed warmly against the night. Then it went out. The entire village disappeared into silver moonlight once again. When I reached the overlook, I paused beside the old inspector's favorite bench. The reservoir stretched quietly before me. By morning, the water would begin rising again. Soon the village would disappear beneath the surface, waiting, just as it always had. And though every house had opened its door to me that night, I was grateful that I had accepted only one invitation. By the time winter began to loosen its grip on the valley, I had almost stopped chasing stories around Ashwood Reservoir, not because the mysteries had ended, because they no longer felt like mysteries. The dam, the water, and forgotten places surrounding them seemed to exist by their own quiet rules. I had learned that some questions were never meant to be answered. They were meant to be carried. Still, there was one story I had never witnessed for myself. Every morning before sunrise, an elderly woman walked to the overlook above the dam, carrying a bundle of white lilies. She had done it for 40 years. No one knew her name. Everyone simply nodded as she passed. I arrived long before dawn. The eastern sky remained dark, with only a faint silver line resting above the mountains. A cool mist drifted across the valley, leaving tiny drops of moisture on the wooden railing. When I breathed in, the air tasted clean and cool, like the first morning after a gentle rain. The overlook stood empty. For a while, then I heard slow footsteps behind me. An elderly woman climbed the path with careful patience. She wore a long gray coat buttoned to her neck, and both hands held a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped in plain paper. She smiled as though we had already met. "You came early." "I didn't want to miss the sunrise," I answered. She nodded. "It arrives at the same time every day." Her voice carried no sadness, only certainty. Together, we stood looking across the reservoir. The water reflected the fading stars while the dam rested quietly beneath the last moments of night. After several minutes, I asked the question everyone seemed afraid to ask. Who are the flowers for? She looked toward the far shoreline. My husband. I waited. He worked here when they were building the dam. She gently adjusted one of the lilies. He promised he'd meet me here every morning before work. A soft smile crossed her face. He kept that promise for 12 years. The first birds of morning began calling from the trees behind us. Their songs drifted gently across the quiet valley. What happened? I asked softly. She looked at the water for a long time before answering. One autumn morning. He never came home. The words carried no bitterness, only memory. They searched for weeks. They found his truck. They found his tools. But they never found him. The sky slowly brightened. Pale gold spread across the eastern horizon. I kept coming anyway, she said. At first because I hoped. Then because I remembered. She laughed quietly. My children thought I was stubborn. Maybe I was. Her smile reminded me of my grandmother. She had once told me that love wasn't measured by the years people spend together. It was measured by the promises they refused to forget. The old woman stepped closer to the railing. Very carefully, she placed the white lilies against the weathered wood. The flowers caught the first light of dawn. For a few peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. The valley remained perfectly still. Even the breeze seemed unwilling to interrupt the morning. Then someone answered, a man's voice, soft, gentle, so beautiful. The words drifted across the reservoir like a memory carried on calm water. I turned immediately. No one stood behind us. No hikers approached the overlook. The voice had come from somewhere ahead. The elderly woman never looked surprised. Instead, she smiled, not with excitement, with recognition. Good morning, she whispered. Her eyes remained fixed on the reservoir. The silence that followed felt warm rather than empty. The first rays of sunlight reached the surface of the water. For one brief moment, I thought I saw another figure standing beside the old woman, a man wearing a work jacket. His hand rested lightly against the railing. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. Then the sunlight brightened. The reflection disappeared. Only the reservoir remained. The woman picked up the paper wrapping from the flowers. They never stay here long, she said. What do you mean? She smiled without answering. We walked slowly back toward the parking area. Halfway down the path, I looked over my shoulder. The lilies were gone. The railing stood empty. No breeze had carried them away. No one had passed us. The woman noticed me looking. He always liked white lilies, she said quietly. I suppose he still does. At her car, she thanked me for keeping her company. Before leaving, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. One day, she said, you'll stop being afraid of the water. I watched her drive away until her car disappeared around the bend. The overlook became quiet once more. Since that morning, I have returned every spring. Sometimes I arrive before sunrise, sometimes after. The woman is never there. Yet every year, for just a few minutes, fresh white lilies rest against the railing. And when the first light touches the reservoir, they are always gone before anyone else arrives. I return to the overlook where everything had begun on the first evening of spring. Years had passed since a retired inspector first handed me binoculars and asked me to look across the reservoir. I had wandered through forgotten tunnels, abandoned cabins, silent villages, and lonely shorelines since then. Each place had left something behind. Not fear, something quieter, a feeling that the reservoir had been listening long before I had learned to listen back. The sun had just slipped behind the western ridge. Its last light lingered on the water, while the evening air carried the smooth, earthy scent of river stones that had been warmed all day beneath the spring sun. It reminded me of childhood afternoons spent skipping rocks with my brother. We never cared how many times they bounced, only that they kept moving. The overlook was empty. The old bench where the retired inspector used to sit remained beneath the same weathered pine tree. I rested my hand against its worn wooden back. Dust had gathered along the seat. No one had been there for some time. I wondered whether he still visited, or whether, like so many others, he had quietly become another story people spoke about in low voices. I sat down. The reservoir stretched peacefully before me. Small ripples drifted across the surface, carrying the fading colors of the evening sky. For the first time in many years, I wasn't searching for anything. I simply watched. Silence settled comfortably around me. It no longer felt empty. It felt familiar. The distant hills slowly darkened as the first stars appeared overhead. Then I noticed something unusual. The reservoir reflected more stars in the sky held above it. I looked up. Only a handful shone through the fading blue. I looked back down. Dozens sparkled across the water. Tiny lights. Steady, gentle, far too many. I rubbed my eyes. The reflection remained unchanged. The stars beneath the water seemed brighter than the ones above, almost as though another night existed below the surface. I smiled to myself. Years earlier, I would have searched for a logical explanation. Now, I simply accepted what I was seeing. The reservoir had taught me that not everything asked to be understood. Some things only asked to be witnessed. A fish broke the surface several yards from shore. Small circles spread quietly across the water before disappearing again. The reflected stars trembled for only a moment, then returned exactly as before. I leaned forward against the railing. The cool wood rested comfortably beneath my hands. My notebook remained closed beside me. There was nothing I needed to write, nothing I wished to prove. The stories had already found their way into me. A soft breeze crossed the overlook. The scent of warm river stones lingered in the air a little longer before fading into the coming night. Then I noticed my reflection. It rested clearly upon the calm surface. The same gray jacket, the same tired smile, the same face that had grown older with every visit to the reservoir. I watched quietly. So did my reflection. Then it raised one hand. I hadn't moved. The reflection waved gently. Not quickly, not urgently. The slow wave of an old friend saying goodbye after a long conversation. My breath caught for only a moment. The hand lowered again. The reflection smiled. Not wider, only softer. Then the surface of the reservoir rippled. The image dissolved into scattered light. When the water became calm once more, only the ordinary reflection of the evening sky remained. I stood slowly. Strangely, I wasn't frightened. The feeling that settled over me was closer to gratitude, as though the reservoir had finally acknowledged my years of listening. Behind me, footsteps crossed the gravel path. I turned, expecting another visitor. The overlook stood empty. Only the wind moved gently through the pine branches. I laughed quietly. The sound surprised even me. It had been a long time since I had laughed beside the reservoir. I picked up my notebook. Before slipping into my coat, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. I didn't remember placing it there. The paper looked old. Its edges had turned yellow with age. Inside, written in the careful handwriting I had seen in the watchman's logbook, were only a few words. You no longer need to keep our stories. Now they will keep you. I read the note twice, then folded it carefully. Instead of placing it back into my notebook, I let it drift into the evening breeze. The paper floated gently across the overlook before settling on the quiet surface of the reservoir. It never became wet. It simply rested there, as though the water had been waiting to receive it. Night settled fully across the valley. The stars above finally matched the countless lights reflected below. I remained at the railing until the last color disappeared from the western sky. For the first time since my journey had begun, I no longer felt like a visitor. I felt remembered. The retired inspector called me just as the last light of autumn began fading from the valley. His voice sounded older than I remembered, not weaker, only quieter. "I have one last inspection to finish," he said. "I'd like you to walk with me." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. An hour later, I met him at the eastern entrance to Ashwood Dam. The evening sky carried soft shades of amber and gray, while a gentle breeze drifted across the reservoir. Workers had recently replaced several sections of the safety railing, and the fresh timber released a clean, comforting scent that reminded me of the lumber yard where my father used to take me on Saturday mornings. The inspector smiled when he noticed me breathing it in. Funny how familiar smells stay with us. They do, I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply looked across the quiet water. It felt strange seeing him again. The first story I had ever collected here had begun with him handing me a pair of binoculars. Now his hands rested on a worn walking stick. Time had quietly done its work. We should start, he said. We stepped onto the dam. The concrete stretched ahead beneath the fading light. Our footsteps echoed softly between the railings before disappearing into the open valley. For several minutes we spoke about ordinary things. The changing seasons, the old maintenance crews, the growing number of visitors who came searching for stories. Then he grew quiet. You know, he looked toward the reservoir. There was one rule every employee learned on the first day. I waited. It was never written in the manuals. It wasn't spoken outside these walls. He stopped walking. If the dam ever counts one person too many. He looked at me carefully. You never go looking for the extra one. The words settled heavily between us. I remembered the caretaker, the watchman's logbook, the silent figures crossing the dam during the siren. Perhaps every story had been pointing toward this one. Did it happen often? I asked. He nodded once. Enough. We continued walking. The evening grew darker. The first lights along the roadway flickered on one by one. Far below, the reservoir reflected each tiny glow until the water seemed filled with quiet stars. Halfway across the dam, we reached an old maintenance checkpoint. Most of the equipment had been removed years earlier. Only a faded attendance board remained attached to the wall. Beside it hung a small mechanical counter, the kind workers once used before electronic systems replaced them. The inspector brushed dust from its face. It still works. He pressed the reset lever. The number changed to 0. He looked at me. You first. I stepped through the narrow gate. The counter clicked softly. 1. He followed behind me. Another click. 2. We smiled. Still accurate, I said. So far. His voice remained calm. We continued another 100 yards before reaching the western checkpoint. An identical counter stood waiting beside the exit. The inspector motioned toward it. Again, I walked through first. Click. 1. He stepped through. Click. The counter paused, then moved again. 3. Neither of us spoke. The quiet evening suddenly felt much larger. The inspector looked at the number for several long moments. Finally, he sighed. It hasn't done this in years. I swallowed. There are only 2 of us. I know. The fresh scent of timber drifted across the bridge once more. It seemed strangely out of place now. I looked back across the length of the dam. The roadway remained empty. No cars, no workers, no distant figures. Only the long stretch of concrete disappearing into twilight. The inspector reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. It was old. The edges had softened with age. I've carried this since my first week here. He handed it to me. Across the top, written in careful handwriting, was a single instruction. Never turn around after the second count. I lowered the paper. We already did. He smiled sadly. Yes. For the first time since our walk began, I noticed something else. There was a third set of footsteps. Not ahead of us. Not behind us. Between us. Soft impressions marked a thin layer of dust that had gathered near the edge of the roadway. They appeared one after another, keeping perfect pace with our own. The inspector never looked down. He simply continued walking toward the far end of the dam. I matched his pace. Neither of us spoke again. The unseen footsteps remained with us until the final yards. Then they quietly stopped. We reached solid ground beyond the dam. The inspector looked back only once. I told you the reservoir remembers. He folded the paper carefully before placing it back into his pocket. I just never told you. He smiled with gentle acceptance. That sometimes it remembers someone who hasn't arrived yet. A cool breeze crossed the valley. When I looked back toward the bridge, the fresh timber gleamed softly beneath the evening lights. The roadway stood completely empty. No footprints. No movement. No sign that anyone had walked there except the 2 of us. The inspector rested a hand on my shoulder. My work is finished. He turned toward the parking lot. without another word. I watched him disappear into the fading light. For a long time, I remained where I was. The dam stretched silently across the reservoir, waiting, as it always had, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, I imagined a mechanical counter quietly resting on the number 3. Years passed before I returned to Ashwood Reservoir. Life carried me other towns, other roads, and quieter days. The notebooks I had filled over the years rested inside a wooden box on the shelf of my study. Sometimes I thought about opening them again. Most evenings, I chose not to. The stories had never truly belonged to me. I had only been trusted to carry them for a while. One warm evening in early summer, I found myself driving the familiar mountain road once more. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and violet. The open window carried the gentle fragrance of blooming night jasmine, just as it had on the evening of my very first visit. Some places change with time. Ashwood Reservoir never seemed to. The overlook waited exactly where I remembered. The old wooden bench remained beneath the weathered pine. The railing had been repaired. Fresh paint covered the signs. Yet the quiet felt wonderfully familiar. I stood there for several minutes, watching the evening settle across the water. The reservoir reflected the fading sky until the surface looked almost endless. For the first time in many years, I wasn't hoping for another mystery. I had come only to say goodbye. The retired inspector was gone now. Harold had retired the previous autumn. The elderly woman with the white lilies had not been seen for several springs. Even the old groundskeeper at the broken marina had become another memory carried by the valley. The people had changed. The reservoir remained. I rested my hands on the railing. The wood felt warm from the day's sunlight. Closing my eyes, I listened. A gentle breeze moved through the pine branches behind me. Small waves touched the distant shoreline. Somewhere across the valley, a lone bird called before evening finally settled into silence. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full, filled with every voice I had ever heard beside this water. The caretaker quietly setting down a cup of tea. The diver warning me not to count the bells. The old woman whispering good morning into the sunrise. The inspector reminding me that the dam sometimes counted one extra traveler. Each memory drifted through my thoughts without sadness, only gratitude. I opened my eyes. The first stars had begun appearing overhead. Their reflections shimmered gently across the reservoir. Then I understood every story, every strange place, every quiet encounter. None of them had been separate. The observation deck, the pump house, the forgotten picnic ground, the flooded village, the cemetery, the lighthouse, the watchman's office. They had all been connected by the same quiet truth. The reservoir had never been haunted by strangers. It remembered everyone who had ever stood beside it, not to frighten them, not to keep them, simply to remember, just as people remember old friends long after they are gone. I smiled. The realization brought an unexpected sense of peace. For years I had searched for answers. Now I understood that the stories themselves had been the answer. I reached into my coat pocket. Inside rested a small notebook that had traveled with me through every chapter of my journey. Its cover had faded. Its pages had yellowed with time. Carefully, I opened it one last time. Every page was blank. Not a single word remained. At first I thought I had brought the wrong notebook. Then I laughed quietly. The reservoir no longer needed me to keep its memories. It had kept them itself. I closed the notebook and placed it gently on the old bench. It felt right to leave it there. The evening breeze stirred once more, carrying the soft fragrance of night jasmine across the overlook. I stepped closer to the railing. Below me, the water rested perfectly calm. Without thinking, I spoke my own name aloud. The sound drifted gently across the reservoir before disappearing into the coming night. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the water answered. Softly, kindly, my name returned. Not loudly, not as an echo, as though someone who had always known me had spoken it with quiet recognition. I felt no fear, only the strange comfort of being remembered. The stars above grew brighter. The reservoir reflected every one of them. Behind me, I thought I heard familiar footsteps crossing the gravel path. I didn't turn around. I already knew who they belonged to. The inspector, Harold, the old fisherman, the woman with the lilies. Perhaps all of them. Perhaps only memory. It no longer mattered. The night deepened. Hours passed without my noticing. The eastern horizon slowly softened into pale blue. Morning arrived as gently as a whispered promise. The first light touched the surface of the reservoir, turning it into a sheet of gold. I looked toward the old bench. The notebook was gone. In its place rested a single white lily. Fresh, bright, covered with tiny drops of morning dew. I smiled. Then, with one last quiet glance across the water, I began to walk back to my car. I never looked behind me. I didn't need to. Some stories are meant to be solved. Others are meant to be lived. And a very rare few wait beside quiet water until someone is willing to listen. I had listened. At last, the reservoir was silent, and so was I.